The Afghanistan story is far from over. In fact, it is only just beginning. My guest today is CNN's Chief National Security Correspondent, CNN Newsroom anchor and author of the Madman Theory and the Shadow War, Jim Sciutto. Jim is joining us from Washington, D.C. Jim, welcome to the program and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's an honor. Jim, we are witnessing the brutality of the Taliban regime every day now. They have not changed as they have campaigned during their advancement in August. What are we missing in the Afghanistan story, and what is there really to be expected now all foreign powers are definitely gone from Afghanistan?
Well, when I speak to my Afghan friends and contacts, they are genuinely worried. They do not see or believe any sort of sincere change in the Taliban, right? You hear from some Taliban leaders now that they will be more moderate in some way. For instance, yes, girls can be educated at the grade level. Yes, women can go to college, but separate from men. But when I speak to Afghans who, of course, experienced Taliban rule before the U.S. invasion, they just don't believe them. And already you have seen scenes in the streets of Kabul and elsewhere of the Taliban beating people. Even worse stories of them going door to door looking for people who work for the U.S. or others. There have been stories of murder, kidnapping, imprisonment. So whatever promises they're making in public or to U.S. and other Western officials, the Afghans, just based on experience, don't believe. They don't believe those promises.
And what was really the American war in Afghanistan? Now, when we say we, I mean the West. Just taken in consideration, we see a complete fallback of Afghanistan to what it was 20 years ago. What have we done there, and what have we not done there?
Well, it's hard to call it anything else but defeat. Yes, stopping al-Qaeda was the main role, the main intention, the main goal of the invasion 20 years ago. And al-Qaeda has been greatly reduced, depleted during that time frame. But it was also to get rid of the Taliban, which had welcomed al-Qaeda into the country. And to see the Taliban take over the whole country, but also so quickly, is a defeat. There's just no other way to describe that. Now, there's lots of blame to go around. By the way, the Afghan forces had many years of U.S. and Western training and weaponry and funding, and they disappeared very quickly. So an enormous part of the responsibility goes on the shoulders of the Afghan forces and the Afghan government. But the fact is, U.S. officials also bear responsibility through multiple administrations because they clearly exaggerated the capabilities of the Afghan security forces. And frankly, the capability and stability of the Afghan government. Because we hear in the U.S. heard for years that, well, Afghan forces, they're getting better, they're fighting harder, they're getting closer to being able to stand on their own. And when the Taliban were advancing, it just wasn't true. It wasn't true.
And we can see that. And how come there was then, taking that in consideration, there was minimum resistance from the Afghan military, given the fact that they were better equipped than the Taliban themselves?
Yeah. There are a lot of elements in this. One that should not be ignored is that Pakistan was helping the Taliban. For one, Pakistan allowed the Taliban bases, in effect, on the Pakistani side of the border for 20 years, bases that they crossed the border freely, often carrying out attacks and so on. So they were supported by Pakistan, that is supposedly an ally to some degree of the U.S., and obviously in this conflict it was not. But there are also reports that during the Taliban's advance across Afghanistan, that they had enormous support from Pakistani forces and intelligence. There were even reports in some of the most recent battles against the last holdouts in the Panjshir Valley that there were Pakistani military forces involved in that. So first of all, the Taliban had help. There's also, you hear often that for Afghan forces, a lot of their decision making was not lack of courage, because for many years, many thousands of them died in fights, in battles against the Taliban, but a judging of direction. They didn't have a lot of confidence in their government, And once it was clear that the U.S. was leaving, and by the way, that withdrawal started under the Trump administration, right? Plans for the withdrawal. They made a calculation that we can't fight back against this, right? That the winds have changed and we're done. Now, you could take issue with that decision, but there was some evidence that if there was some small presence of U.S. and Western forces on the ground, that might have helped preserve some of those Afghan forces in place, just as a sign of confidence in them, and so on. I mean, the point being, though, there's a lot of blame to go around here, a lot of elements. It's not as simple as one thing. But at the end of the day, the result is the same, and that is the Taliban is in charge again, and 20 years of war and investment, much of it seems to have gone to waste.
Exactly. And what do you think, Jim? Is Afghanistan an enslaved nation? Why try westernize a Middle Eastern country? How to explain that to the American public, especially because the American public, the citizens, they pay taxes from which these wars are actually being financed?
Well, our country had two very long, very bloody, difficult lessons in the difficulties of nation building abroad with two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. If for those who believed, if you go back to the George W. Bush administration, that with the security of U.S. forces on the ground, investment, help building institutions, government agencies, holding elections, etc., in both Iraq and Afghanistan, perhaps with more success in Iraq than Afghanistan, but still, you certainly see the challenges in both places, not to mention, of course, the many thousands, many tens of thousands of civilian deaths, that this idea that the U.S. could export democracy or even something close to democracy backed by force just didn't work. It didn't work. And those ambitions have been pared down over the years to, not necessarily having a U.S.-style democracy, if anybody actually believed that, but having some sort of stable government and being able to hold off the worst extremist forces. But even that collapsed in a matter of weeks in Afghanistan. It's a lesson, really, in the failure of nation building. And the American public, I think, turned against that, both Democrats and Republicans, some time ago, a large portion of it. But the lesson in the fall of Afghanistan is just so bleak. It's hard not to take away, the failure of U.S. policy in both those places over the last 20 years.
We see the history keep repeating itself over and over again. What are your thoughts on the evacuations from Kabul? There's a lot of blame now going to Joe Biden, as in the evacuations could have been done earlier or better and not as, how they say, sloppy as they have done. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, clearly they could have started earlier and more aggressively, right? You have so many tens of thousands. So let's set aside Americans for a moment. You have many thousands of Americans there, people holding U.S. citizenry. Plus you have tens of thousands of Afghans who worked for the Americans and therefore are under threat. These are the special immigrant visa applicants, or at least those who might be eligible for it. It takes time to identify those people and find paths out of the country for those people. And with the faster than expected fall of Kabul and the Afghan government, but also foot dragging, it seems, at the beginning. And this, by the way, goes back to the Trump administration. You just couldn't get all those people out by the limited time that you had. One of the biggest criticisms you'll hear from, and this is not just from Republicans here in the U.S., but also Democrats, was that the withdrawal was not conditional, right? It was a date set. We're going to be out by this date, regardless of what happens or what sort of cooperation we get from the Taliban, et cetera. Had it been, for instance, condition-based, you could conceivably see that, where they said we will leave once we have all the people out we want to get out or try to get out. Maybe the circumstances would have been different. Now, on the flip side, there are those who say that had you set that condition, you would have had to defend that condition, right? And have the forces on the ground being willing to fight back whatever opposition you have from the Taliban or others. But listen, the bottom line is you didn't get all the Americans out, and you're far from getting the many Afghans out who are in danger right now from the Taliban. So that, as much as the administration says it was an extraordinary success, and by the way, getting that many tens of thousands of people out, sure, But it's not all the people who want to get out, probably not even close to most of the people who want to get out. So that, that means you just didn't have enough time. You didn't start early enough and do it fast enough.
And Jim, one last question. What about women's rights under Taliban? We mentioned it in the beginning of our conversation. Now, how do we explain the next generation what we, the West again, did or did not manage to do there?
Women are afraid. I've been to Afghanistan many times, and I've been to so many girls' schools there and met them and spoke with them and spoke to their parents, their fathers, their mothers and their fathers, right, about how happy they were that this was one of the most welcome changes following the fall of the Taliban and following the US and NATO invasion. I speak to many of those same women now, and they feel that they've lost it all. They've lost it. And it's heartbreaking for them and their families. Now, like we said earlier, the Taliban is saying, hey, we have no problem with girls going to school, but the Afghans I talk to just don't buy that. I mean, I know, for instance, there's a real effort now just to get all the female students who were at the American University in Kabul out of the country, not just to have a better life and education, but because they're under threat, right? I mean, there are concerns that women who went to school could be attacked by the Taliban. So the level of fear among women there and disappointment and sadness is real, and it's heartbreaking to hear. Is this
it? Is this all that we can provide them with? The insecurity, the fear. What do we do? What is the next? Where's the international community concerned about this, or is this really it?
Well, the hope is, you hear this from U.S. officials and from others, that the Taliban needs financial help, that the country is set for an economic collapse, they've got food shortages, etc. They can't survive without international aid, and therefore that's leverage. Leverage for the U.S., leverage for Europe, the United Nations. We'll give you that aid, but you have to behave somewhat responsibly here. That's the theory, right? But the Taliban has many of the chips as well, right? I mean, they control the country. They control it militarily and politically. So how much do they respond to that leverage? We'll see. We'll see. It's going to be a test, but certainly the U.S. and the West has far less leverage than it had before.
Jim, thank you so much for your time in discussion. We still have so many questions, but of course our time is always so short. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, and looking forward to speaking with you soon again. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. My guest today was CNN's Chief National Security Correspondent, CNN's Newsroom anchor, and author of The Madman Theory and the Shadow War, Jim Sciutto. Thank you for watching.